There's a moment, late at night when you can't sleep, when you find yourself scrolling through their photos without remembering why you opened their profile in the first place. And in that moment, you wonder if they ever do the same thing. You wonder if, somewhere across the city or the world, they're also awake, thinking about you, holding back words that deserve to be said. And then there's this feeling, this almost unbearable pull, that they're trying to tell you something, that they have something important to say, but there's a wall of silence between you now. The question haunts you. What is it? What do they still need to tell you? Maybe you've even fantasized about it. The conversation, the moment they finally reach out and everything makes sense. Maybe they'd explain why things fell apart the way they did. Maybe they'd say the things they were too afraid or too proud to say when you were together. Maybe they'd tell you that they made a mistake, or that you made one, or that you both did, and you'd finally get the closure that feels like it's been stolen from you. But here's what most people don't realize. The real message your ex has been trying to communicate has nothing to do with the words they might eventually speak. It's far deeper than that. And the fact that you haven't heard it yet isn't really about them holding back. It's about something happening inside you, something you're not ready to see. Let me take you back to a feeling you've had before, because I promise this matters. Think about those arguments you had. Not the ones about forgotten anniversaries or who forgot to call, but the deeper fights where you felt misunderstood in a way that made your chest tight. The ones where no matter what you said, they just didn't get it. They looked at you with eyes that suddenly seemed like they belonged to a stranger. And in that moment you realized something unsettling. The person you loved was operating from an entirely different version of reality than the one you were living in. They were seeing you through a lens you didn't know existed. They were interpreting your actions, your words, your silences through a filter that had nothing to do with your actual intentions. This is where the psychology gets interesting. Your ex isn't struggling to find the right words to tell you something. They're struggling because they realized something terrifying about themselves during your time together. And that realization never left them. It lives in them like a quiet ache they've learned to ignore but can't quite escape. What they have to tell you is a truth about themselves that they're still trying to understand, and part of them hopes that if they ever got the chance to say it to you, maybe you could make sense of it in a way they can't. When we're in relationships, we become mirrors for each other without always realizing it. The things that triggered you in your ex, the ways they hurt you, the patterns you watched them repeat, these weren't random. Your nervous system was picking up on something real, something authentic about who they were at their core. And their nervous system was doing the same thing with you. They were seeing something in you that maybe you didn't want to see in yourself. They were witnessing aspects of your behavior, your insecurities, your defense mechanisms that you'd successfully hidden from everyone else because they were close enough to pierce through the illusions. Here's what so many people miss. Your ex thinks about you because you were the only person who got close enough to see them. Not the version of themselves they show to the world. Not the carefully constructed image they present in the mirror each morning, but the raw, unfiltered person underneath all the armor. And that experience of being seen that completely without the safety of physical distance or the protection of a crowd is one of the most terrifying things a human being can experience. It creates a bond that doesn't simply disappear when a relationship ends. It becomes a haunting. They still have something to tell you because there's a part of them that wants you to know they were aware of how they made you feel. They want you to know that the way they hurt you wasn't coming from a place of cruelty, but from their own unhealed wounds. They want you to understand that when they withdrew emotionally, it wasn't because you weren't worth staying present for, but because staying present with their own feelings was too much. They want to explain that their inability to meet you where you were emotionally wasn't a reflection of your value, but a reflection of how broken they felt on the inside. But they can't say these things because they're still afraid that if they do, you might finally see the truth, that they couldn't love you the way you needed to be loved because they didn't know how to love themselves. And this is the moment where the real message starts to become clear. The thing your ex is still struggling to tell you isn't really meant for your ears at all. It's a message they need to tell themselves. And the reason you feel like they have something to communicate is because you're subconsciously aware that their growth, their healing, their becoming a better version of themselves is somehow linked to the experience of having loved you. You were the catalyst that forced them to look at themselves honestly for the first time. You were the relationship that exposed all the ways they were broken. And sometimes in the middle of the night when they can't sleep, they realize that they owe you a confession. Not about anything they did, but about everything they learned. Think about the attachment patterns you were dealing with. Maybe your ex had a deep fear of abandonment that manifested as controlling behavior, as constant monitoring, as an inability to trust you even when you were completely faithful. Or maybe they had the opposite fear, a fear of engulfment that made them pull away whenever things got too intimate, that made them need space the moment you started to feel secure. These patterns didn't come from nowhere. They came from wounds that were carved into their nervous system long before you met them. And when they were with you, every interaction was filtered through that original wound. They were seeing you through the lens of every person who had ever hurt them before. This is why you can't get closure just from them telling you what happened, because the story of why your relationship ended doesn't actually belong to them alone. It belongs to both of you, shaped by both of your histories, both of your fears, both of your ways of protecting yourselves from the kind of vulnerability that real love demands. Your ex is haunted, not because they can't explain what happened, but because they're slowly realizing that the end of your relationship wasn't about you failing to be good enough. It was about both of you being too wounded to give each other what you actually needed. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from loving someone who can't love you back in the way you deserve. It's different from betrayal. It's different from sudden rejection. It's the slow realization that the person you care about is trying. They really are trying, but they're fundamentally unable to meet you because they haven't healed from their past. And what makes this pain so unbearable is that you can see the potential. You can see who they could become if they did the work. You can see how capable they are of deep love, of presence, of commitment. But there's something invisible, something embedded in their psyche that keeps pulling them back into old patterns. And eventually, you realize that you can't be the person who heals them. You can't love them hard enough to fix what's broken. Your ex thinks about you because you represented the possibility of transformation, not because you could change them, but because loving you forced them to see parts of themselves that they'd been able to ignore before. Every time you expressed a need that they couldn't meet, every time you cried because they had withdrawn, every time you asked for honesty and they couldn't give it, they were being confronted with their own limitations. And that's a painful mirror to live in front of. It's almost impossible to bear. So what happens? They leave, not because you're not worth staying for, but because staying would mean looking at themselves every single day and admitting that they're not the person they want to be. It's too much. It's easier to walk away and convince themselves that the relationship simply wasn't right, that you weren't compatible, that things just didn't work out. But here's what they don't tell you, and what you need to understand. The moment you left, or they left, or you mutually agreed to end things, part of them started to grieve. Not for you specifically, but for the version of themselves that they saw reflected in your eyes. They lost their mirror. They lost the person who was close enough to see through all their defenses. And in losing that, they lost something that felt almost necessary to their sense of self. This is why thoughts of you keep returning. This is why they watch your stories or check your location or reach out and then delete the message before sending. They're not trying to get back together. They're trying to go back in time to before they knew how broken they were. What they still have to tell you is something they might never actually articulate, but you can feel it anyway. It's the silent acknowledgement that you mattered, that you changed them, that even though the relationship ended, even though you moved on, the fundamental way they understand love and connection will always be shaped by what they learned from you. You showed them what real vulnerability looks like. You showed them what it feels like to be seen without judgment. You showed them what they're capable of wanting, even if they weren't capable of sustaining it. But here's where most people get stuck and where the real psychological insight matters most. You're waiting for your ex to tell you something that you actually need to tell yourself. You're waiting for them to validate your experience of the relationship, to confirm that the connection was real, that the pain was justified, that you mattered in a way that was transformative. And the reason you're waiting is because part of you never fully believed it in the first place. Part of you internalized your ex's inability to stay as evidence that you weren't worth staying for. Their emotional unavailability became your proof that you were too much or not enough, or fundamentally unlovable in some way that made sense only to them. This is the real message that's been trying to reach you. Not a message from them, but a message you need to receive about yourself. The truth is that your ex's inability to love you well had nothing to do with your worth. It had everything to do with their capacity, and capacity is not the same as value. You can be absolutely, undeniably worthy of deep love and still attract someone who doesn't have the emotional bandwidth to give it. You can be beautiful and intelligent and kind and still connect with someone whose trauma makes them incapable of receiving those gifts without sabotaging what they have. The psychological pattern at work here is something called anxious attachment. If you spent the relationship trying harder, doing more, being more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, then you likely have this pattern. And what happens with anxious attachment is that you become the pursuer in relationships. You chase not necessarily the person, but the possibility of being loved by someone who is fundamentally unavailable. Why? Because on some level, being with someone unavailable keeps you safe. It gives you something to work toward, something to fix, someone to prove yourself to. It protects you from the terrifying vulnerability of being fully loved exactly as you are. Your ex is still haunting your thoughts because they're the embodiment of that pattern for you. They're the one who showed you that no matter what you do, no matter how much you give, you can't force someone to choose you. You can't love them into healing. You can't try hard enough to earn their ability to be present. And that's a humbling, necessary realization. But the way you're interpreting it is all wrong. You're interpreting it as evidence that there's something wrong with you, when actually it's evidence that there was something wrong with the match. Think about this differently. What if your ex isn't actually trying to tell you something about them, but something about you? What if the message they're desperately wanting to communicate is, I couldn't give you what you deserved, but that wasn't because you were wrong to want it. You were right to want to be prioritized. You were right to want emotional presence. You were right to want to be chosen. You were right to feel hurt when I couldn't give those things. The problem wasn't that you were asking too much. The problem was that I didn't know how to give what you were asking for, and instead of admitting that to myself, I made it about you being too needy, too sensitive, too dependent. I gaslit you into believing that the very real and healthy needs you had were actually character flaws. This is the confession that haunts them. Not that they cheated or lied or betrayed you in some obvious way, but that they hurt you through their emotional absence and then made you responsible for that hurt. They let you believe that if you could just be less, want less, need less, they could show up for you. And you spent the relationship shrinking yourself, accommodating their limitations, treating their emotional unavailability as if it were a puzzle you could solve if you were just patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough. Here's what nobody tells you about breakups with emotionally unavailable partners. The grief doesn't come from losing them. It comes from finally acknowledging that the relationship you were trying so hard to build was never actually possible. They weren't just going through a phase. They weren't just scared and would come around if you gave them more time. They had a fundamental limitation in their capacity for emotional intimacy, and no amount of love from you could change that. And once you see that, once it becomes undeniable, you have to grieve not just the relationship, but the dream of the relationship. You have to let go of the version of them that you were hoping they'd become. But something interesting happens when you finally let go of that dream, when you stop waiting for them to tell you something and start telling yourself the truth instead. You realize that their emotional absence in the relationship wasn't actually about anything you did or didn't do. It was about their own terror of being vulnerable. It was about their own wounds. It was about their own incapacity to handle the intensity of being truly seen by another person. And once you see it that clearly, once you understand it as their limitation rather than your failure, something shifts inside you. You become free. Not because they finally said the right thing or finally gave you closure or finally acknowledged how much they hurt you, but because you stop needing that acknowledgement from them. You give it to yourself. You say to yourself the things you've been waiting to hear from them. What you felt in this relationship was real. Your love was real. Your need for partnership was real. The way they hurt you was real, and none of it was your fault. None of it was because you were wrong. It was because they couldn't show up the way you needed them to. And that's sad, but it's not a reflection of your worth. This is the profound realization that changes everything. Your ex doesn't actually have something new to tell you. The message they've been trying to communicate through their silence, through their inability to reach out, through the way they keep the distance between you firm, is simply, I couldn't be what you needed, and you've known this all along. You felt it in every withdrawal, every dismissal, every time they made you feel small for wanting more. The real question isn't what they still need to tell you, it's what you finally need to tell yourself. You need to tell yourself that you were right to want more. You need to tell yourself that your needs were never too much. You need to tell yourself that the way you loved was never the problem. The problem was that they couldn't receive it. And receiving love, truly receiving it, requires a level of emotional availability that they simply didn't have. And here's the part that's almost cruel in its beauty. Once you understand this, once you fully integrate this truth into your nervous system, you'll actually feel less drawn to them. Not because you'll stop caring, but because you'll finally stop looking for them to validate something about yourself. You'll stop unconsciously hoping that if they just came back and said the right thing, you could finally feel okay about yourself. Because you'll realize that your okayness has nothing to do with them. It never did. It was always within you. You were just looking in the wrong direction. Your ex is probably going to stay in your thoughts because you shared something real together. Because they changed you. Because for a period of time, you were as vulnerable as you knew how to be with another human being. That's not something that simply disappears. But what can change is the meaning you make of it. Instead of seeing the relationship as evidence that you're unlovable, you can see it as evidence that you have the capacity to love deeply and that you deserve someone who can meet that love with their own. The most profound thing your ex could tell you, and the thing that would actually heal you if you could hear it, is probably something they can never say because they don't fully understand it themselves yet. It's the realization that you were right all along, that the distance they created, the walls they built, the way they made you feel crazy for wanting what every human being fundamentally wants, to be loved, to be seen, to be chosen, that was all a defense mechanism. It had nothing to do with your actual value and everything to do with their own fear. But you don't need them to tell you this. You're already starting to understand it. The fact that you're asking this question, that you're wondering what they still need to say, means that somewhere inside you, you're beginning to question whether their silence has anything to do with you. And it doesn't. It's about their inability to face what they became in the relationship. It's about their resistance to the growth that loving you demanded of them. It's about their fear that if they ever fully acknowledged how much they hurt you, they'd have to admit to themselves that they're the kind of person who hurts people they claim to love. So they stay silent, they keep their distance, they let the relationship dissolve into ambiguity rather than honest closure, because honest closure would require them to do the same thing that you're doing right now, to look at themselves with brutal honesty and admit where they fell short. And that's hard, so they tell themselves that the relationship just wasn't right, that you wanted different things, that it was nobody's fault. And maybe on some level they even believe it. But you're beginning to see through that narrative. You're beginning to understand that it was their fault. Not because they're a bad person, but because they made a choice every single day to protect themselves instead of being vulnerable with you. They made a choice to withdraw when you reached out. They made a choice to stay defended instead of letting you see them. And those choices had consequences. They created a distance that made it impossible for the relationship to survive. This is the message they still have to tell you, and it's not a message of reconciliation or rekindled love. It's a message of accountability. It's an acknowledgement that they know they hurt you. They know they weren't enough. They know that you needed more, and they know that they couldn't give it. But they're terrified to say it because once you hear it, they can't hide from themselves anymore. You become a living reminder of their limitation. So here you are, waiting, wondering, checking their profiles, imagining the conversation. But the conversation you're imagining is actually happening inside you right now. Every time you ask yourself what they might say, you're creating the space for your own deeper understanding. Every time you imagine their explanation, you're actually articulating your own truth. And every time you feel that pull toward them, that sense that they have something important to communicate, you're actually feeling your own need to be understood and validated by yourself. This is the real transformation that comes from truly letting go of a relationship with someone emotionally unavailable. It's not that you stop missing them or thinking about them. It's that you stop needing them to complete the narrative. You stop waiting for them to provide the explanation that will finally make sense of why it hurt so much. You accept that the hurt makes sense because you loved genuinely and they couldn't receive it. And that's enough. That's sad, but it's enough. Your ex doesn't get to be the hero of your story anymore. They're just a character in it. An important one, yes. A transformative one, absolutely. But not the main character. You are. And the realization that you've been waiting for them to validate your experience is actually the moment you take your power back. because once you understand that your worth was never theirs to confirm or deny, once you understand that the love you gave was good and real regardless of whether they could receive it, you're free. You're finally free. And maybe someday they'll reach out and try to tell you something. Maybe they'll explain themselves. Maybe they'll apologize. Maybe they'll say they made a mistake. Maybe they'll finally acknowledge all the things they couldn't say when you were together. But here's what you need to know right now. You don't actually need them to do that anymore, because you're beginning to understand the deepest truth that this entire relationship was trying to teach you. And that truth is about you, not about them. It's about discovering that you have the capacity to love deeply, to be vulnerable, to give of yourself fully. And that capacity is something to celebrate, not something to be ashamed of. The world will show you people who are ready to receive that love. People who won't make you feel like there's something wrong with you for having needs. People who won't make you shrink yourself to fit into their emotional limitations. People who won't vanish the moment things get real. And you'll find them because you've learned something invaluable from this relationship. You'll know the difference between people who are just scared and people who are actually willing to do the work to overcome that fear. Your ex gave you that education. They showed you what it looks like when someone chooses their defense mechanisms over their connection with you. And that's a gift, even though it doesn't feel like one right now. Because once you fully integrate this lesson, you'll never settle for that again. You'll never again convince yourself that a silent partner is just being thoughtful. You'll never again interpret emotional absence as mysterious depth. You'll never again wait for someone to finally tell you what you deserve to hear, because you'll be telling it to yourself. And that voice, the voice that comes from your own understanding, your own experience, your own hard-won wisdom, that voice is infinitely more powerful than any explanation they could ever offer. Stay with that voice. Let it grow louder. Let it become the primary guide for how you understand your relationships going forward. And watch how everything changes when you stop waiting for permission from your past to create your future. If you felt that pull, that wondering about what your ex still needs to tell you, if you've caught yourself imagining that conversation that might finally give you peace, then you know the weight of unresolved connection. There are more dimensions to this psychological landscape that we haven't explored yet, deeper patterns that shape not just your past relationships, but your future ones. The insights that could change the trajectory of your romantic life are out there, waiting for you to be ready to receive them. Stay subscribed to understand not just what your exes couldn't tell you, but more importantly, what you need to learn about yourself. Haiku 4.5 Extended.